During trade negotiations connected to the USMCA agreement, the Trump administration pressured Canada to sell key natural resources to the United States at prices below production cost. These resources included energy, lumber, steel-related materials, and critical minerals essential for manufacturing and infrastructure. The stated objective was to lower costs for American industries and secure long-term access to strategic materials. However, selling below cost would have forced Canadian producers into sustained losses, leading to layoffs, reduced investment, and long-term damage to Canada's domestic supply chain. Canada refused to accept these terms. Instead of confronting the United States publicly, Canadian officials chose a quieter strategy. Regulatory approvals were delayed, legal safeguards were strengthened, and alternative export markets in Europe and Asia were explored. The Canadian government was concerned that agreeing to below-cost sales would collapse domestic pricing structures and permanently weaken national industries that form the backbone of its export economy. The refusal led to increased pressure from the United States. Tariffs were imposed on Canadian steel and aluminum, and further trade threats were made against automotive and manufacturing exports. These measures disrupted cross-border supply chains that had been stable for decades. Businesses operating on both sides of the border faced rising costs, contract uncertainty, and logistical delays, undermining confidence across multiple industries. Supply chains rely on predictability, stable pricing, and long-term trust between partners. The introduction of tariffs, shifting trade rules, and political pressure created uncertainty that forced companies to change behavior. Producers reduced output to limit losses, manufacturers began stockpiling raw materials, and logistics firms rerouted shipments to avoid risk. These decisions increased inefficiency and raised costs across the entire supply chain. By the time the COVID-19 pandemic struck, supply chains were already weakened by years of trade instability. Factory shutdowns, transportation bottlenecks, and labor shortages amplified problems that already existed. The pandemic did not create the supply chain crisis. It exposed structural weaknesses that had developed due to repeated trade conflicts and policy unpredictability. The damage caused during this period was not temporary. Many companies permanently restructured their supply chains to reduce dependence on North American trade routes. Governments began prioritizing domestic control over strategic resources, while long-term closed contracts replaced open market sourcing. This shift reduced flexibility and increased price volatility across global markets. Reversing these changes has proven difficult. Trust between trading partners was eroded, and rebuilding it requires consistent policy, long-term agreements, and political stability. Instead, global trade has moved toward fragmentation, with countries focusing on self-sufficiency rather than cooperation. This environment has made supply chains more expensive, slower, and less resilient. The political response remains divided. Supporters of the Trump administration argue that aggressive trade pressure was necessary to protect American industries and reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. Critics counter that the strategy weakened alliances, increased costs for consumers and manufacturers, and reduced overall supply security. Canada, once one of the United States' most reliable trade partners, has since taken active steps to reduce economic dependence on the U.S. market. The broader lesson is that supply chains cannot be controlled through coercion. Forcing trade partners to sell resources below cost destabilizes production systems and discourages investment. Once trust and predictability are removed, supply chains adapt in ways that are difficult to reverse. The current supply chain crisis reflects not a single decision, but a series of policy choices that prioritize short-term leverage over long-term stability.